Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm GC Smith, and today we're going to be talking about Modern, or more specifically, the effects of Pro Tour over the Gatewatch on the Modern format as a whole. So this last weekend was Pro Tour over the Gatewatch, a dual format Pro Tour with Modern constructed and over the Gatewatch draft. And boy, I had absolute tons of fun watching this Pro Tour for the first day, and then the second day did get a little bit repetitive, but that is generally the case with Modern normally. But this time it was for a very different reason. It wasn't because of seeing Splinter Twin or Infect for like the 20th time in a row. No, it was for seeing Eldrazi pretty much every single match. There was a ton of Eldrazi there this weekend, and it really did break open the format. In fact, it was Eldrazi decks that just swept the entire format away this weekend. Team Channel Fireball and Team Face to Face Games turned up with a great colorless Eldrazi deck, but it was really the blue-red Eldrazi deck that was overall winner. That played by Jason Tao, sorry if I mispronounced his name, and the rest of his team that dominated the show. Because not only was it an Eldrazi deck that dominates the format, like most Eldrazi decks are doing at the moment, but it's absolutely amazing in the mirror, which was absolutely spectacular for him in the top 8, because it meant he was able to quite easily beat the 3 colorless Eldrazi decks he faced on the way to winning the Pro Tour. And I just have to say right now that the Modern format is absolutely unhealthy because of these Eldrazi decks. Now, there are a lot of people saying that the Modern format is fine, or we actually need to wait and see. We can't determine the health of the format right now. And they do have good reasons for this. Reason first is that the Pro Tour is normally not a healthy format. It's normally degenerative and not representative of the format as a whole, because in addition to just wanting to play a deck at the Pro Tour like a good deck, you generally want to play against or beat the other teams, like pro teams, the kind of players you'd expect to play their decks. And so the idea being is you try and work out what they would play and then play a deck that preys on them, because it's a very hostile metagame and it's not normally representative of the meta as a whole. You may remember last year's Modern Pro Tour where Abzan was seeing tons of play, but then straight after Twin really was the overall winner, and Twin saw a lot more play after that event than Abzan did. So it wasn't really a good representative of the format as a whole, necessarily. But I do think that this argument doesn't quite work for the blue-red Eldrazi deck, or the other Eldrazi decks. And the reason behind that is just as I mentioned. Even though Abzan and the various forms of it, like Abzan Company and whatever, were there in its spades at the last Modern Pro Tour, they didn't overall win the event. It was Splinter Twin. And looking at blue-red Eldrazi, or the Eldrazi decks, not only were they not the most popular deck there, for one thing, and so you can't really compare them to the Abzan deck, but it was definitely the most powerful deck. It had less than 10% of the metagame in total of the day 1 standings, I believe, and nearly 100% of the players that played the Eldrazi deck made day 2. Just on the back of their Eldrazi deck. Even if they went 0-3 in the draft, they could get through with their Eldrazi deck. In fact, 100% of Team Face to Face Games and Team Channel Fireball who were on the colorless Eldrazi deck made day 2. And most of the people on blue-red Eldrazi did. A couple people didn't. I'd imagine they were probably some of the worst players on that team. But I don't know them, so I don't want to really say they were the worst players necessarily. They may have just had unfortunate hands or bad draws. But either way, looking at these decks, there was no way they stumbled due to being a bad deck. They absolutely dominated the format, and they turned that 10% day 1 representation to, I think, 75% of the top 8, which is a huge conversion rate. And nothing like that has been achieved, they were saying, since Coreblade formats, where Standard was dominated by Coreblade. There's not been a Pro Tour since that, really, that's had this kind of level of domination. And some are saying this was even worse than Coreblade. And I have to say that this deck just is going to be good going on, and we have started to see this on Magic Online in the leagues, and I'm sure people have started seeing that in their shops as people have brought these decks to midweek events over the last couple of days, or have brought it to the beginning of week events, shall I say. Because the reality is, this deck is not only really, really good, it is incredibly hard to reliably hate out, and there are several reasons for that. Now, people are saying that the best way to hate the deck is something like Blood Moon or Ensnaring Bridge, or to go Sweepers with Supreme Verdict and whatnot. And I do think both ways are incredibly bad independently, and when you combine them are probably not that good either. So let me tackle the first version of hate and why it's bad, the mana denial or the stopping them attacking, and then I'll go into the Sweepers. So the reason why the turn 2 Blood Moon Ensnaring Bridge plan is really bad, although they are arguably better against the colourless version of the deck over the blue-red version of the deck, is because the blue-red or the Eldrazi decks can get out enough threats on turn 1 or 2 that unless you're on the play, there's not much you can do against them. They can turn 1 put out multiple Endless Ones or Eldrazi Mimics, theoretically, or at least 2-1 on turn 2, turn 1, and maybe even ride that to victory as you're too busy trying to stop them doing the other things. Or if they're on the play and not you, they can turn to Thought Knot Seer and strip away any hate you have, which just is really, really good. Or just flood the board in such a way that your hate's too slow anyway. And even if you manage to get a turn 2 Blood Moon before they get anything really going, all you've done is turn their mana into red, which if they're the red-blue Eldrazi deck, they can use that mana. All you've done is slow them down, you've not shut them out of the game. And in order to slow the deck down to a point where they have to play on curve, and you haven't necessarily shut down the deck because they do run some form of, or some of the decks at least run a version of single copy of Wastes. They run multiple copies of Islands or stuff to allow them to play their spells even through Blood Moon. In order to do that reliably, you have to run 4 copies of Blood Moon mainboard because you want to be able to do this game 1. You're also therefore running 4 copies of Pyretic Ritual, I think it is, 2 mana, get 3. Might actually be Desperate Ritual I'm thinking of, Desperate Ritual, and you're running 4 copies of Simian Spirit Guide. So you're now running 12 copies of cards to really hate on them. 16 if you're doing the Ensnaring Bridge version. But all you do again is slow them down. Ensnaring Bridge doesn't shut them out because they are able to create Scions or weaker attackers that can still hit you. And if they're the blue-red version, games 2 and 3, they have a way to deal with Ensnaring Bridge. But no, let's say game 1, you get Ensnaring Bridge out, whether you still don't stop their deck. And like I say, you're running 12 or 16 versions of cards to try and stop them doing their thing, when all you really do is slow them down or hinder them slightly, don't stop them. And then what are you running to kill them quickly? Anything you run to kill them quickly now dilutes your game plan of trying to stall them. And they generally don't care about anything you play that, unless you're playing something bigger than they're doing, and they're playing the bigger things. It's not to say you can't play Blood Moon, Desperate Ritual, Ensnaring Bridge, and Summoning Spirit Guide and stop them. But then you also have to remember, if you're running Ensnaring Bridge, you now can't hit them with big attackers. And they can still play big blockers with Ensnaring Bridge on the field. So now the game goes down to who wins? And let's say they have a Vile Aggregate. Vile Aggregate allows them to ingest you a couple of times, doesn't necessarily have huge power unless they play a lot of creatures to the board, and now you're the one that's going to be drawing your last card first. And again, that's not including the fact they could easily just play a load of things turn 1 and you lose because your deck's far too slow. And the whole thing, they fail on the play, they can Thought Not See anything you do before you play. Really, I think the decks have to dedicate too much to the hate for the hate to be effective. Really, when you want to do things like Blood Moon, you want to combine it with a clock, which is why the decks that normally do well with Blood Moon A, are aggressive decks, and B, sideboard Blood Moon. They don't dedicate slots to ramping out the Blood Moon, they just play it on turn 3. But that's the problem, is turn 3 is too slow for a deck that can Fortnot Seer you on turn 2 and take the Blood Moon. And again, that's why actually the Supreme Verdict or board wiping plan is bad. Because unless you're running counter spells and single target removal to stop them doing that, and it has to be counter spells, it has to be mana leak in things like that to stop them doing that kind of thing, playing Fortnot Seer. But the problem is then they can still just play a few things on turn 1 and 2 before Mana Leak is active, especially if they're on the play, and then wait for you to sweep. You're going to have to sweep, and if they can play multiple things a turn, there's not much you can do to stop them playing multiple things a turn. Because, yeah, if they're able to get to the point where they're playing multiple things a turn, Mana Leak's not doing good enough. You stop one of their spells, not both of them, or all of them. And eventually they'll force you to sweep, and then just play things again after the sweep when your counterspell magic's down. The deck is super reliable against all of these. And the fact that it plays 3 mainboard Dismember, which is an amazing removal spell in this deck, I absolutely love it, gives them so much more resilience. I've had people that play Painter Servant to try and stop me, and realise how bad that is when I end of turn Dismember their Painter Servant. Because they're now playing Painter Servant in their own deck. They're playing a 1-3 for 2 to try and stop me. Again, they're diluting their own deck to try and aggressively slow my deck down when it doesn't really stop my deck. I can still cast my spells without being able to use Eye of Ugin, for example. It may slow me down, certainly, but it doesn't stop me, and they're still playing a 1-3 for 2. And we all know that 1-3 for 2s generally aren't that ideal unless you're winning the game off them, like 1 Thors for 3. Things like that aren't really what things people want to be playing unless it goes infinite, as Twin showed us. And that's the thing, is that all these hates and all these things to really hate it are either too slow or too weak by making your own deck weaker. It doesn't stop them. There's nothing really that stops them. The best I can think of currently is something like Meddling Mage. But again, they've got so many different threats that Meddling Mage doesn't do enough. And that's really my problem, especially since they can still play Dismember to deal with that. So, the too long didn't really watch or listen of this video is I think the modern format is really unhealthy right now. I think it's in a really bad place that there's not much you can do to really hate on it. And those thinking that the modern format will adjust itself, sure, you might be right, but I think it's incredibly unlikely. And let me leave you this last point. Let's assume that the format can adjust itself to the Eldrazi deck. I still think that's bad, that the entire format has to shift so much in order to beat one deck. Like I said, people are getting to the point where they're having to think of running 12 or 16 or 20 cards in their deck just to shut down one deck. That's all in your main board as well, because you can't have A, that many hate cards in your sideboard, B, you still want to be able to sideboard against the other decks in the format, because sure, you're good against the Eldrazi deck, but if your decks are good enough to push the Eldrazi deck out the format, you're now just going to lose to every other fair deck in the format because your hate doesn't do anything against them. And then what are you going to do? Just, that's the big problem as well, is that if you do hate enough on this one deck, you just lose to every other deck in the format that exists. And admittedly, those decks might not be able to exist because of the Eldrazi deck preying on them. So, but no, the format becomes incredibly degenerate, even if you can adjust to this Eldrazi deck. And so that's why I think something will be banned. Something from it I think does need to be banned. And for me, that has to be Eye of Ugin. Something that gives the deck multiple 2 mana a turn, multiple jots of that 2 mana, and can tutor them when they're at the end game, which, by the way, tutoring with that is insane when you get empty-handed. It is brilliant. And I say it has to be Eye of Ugin that shuts it down, gets banned. And I know there's a lot of Tron players going, no, ban Eldrazi Temple because you want Eye of Ugin. Trust me, you want Eye of Ugin gone. Eldrazi Temple is not the thing. that really powers this deck out. Sure, you can have multiple Eldrazi Temple on the field. That's kind of cool. But it's either Ugin that allows you to play 3 2-drops turn 1, not Eldrazi Temple. So it's either Ugin that allows them to take over the game on turn 1, whereas Eldrazi Temple allows them to do it on turn 2 or 3, which again is still too fast, and arguably both can get banned, but I'm not sure they'll execute the deck that hard. I'd like to see them banning one of them to begin with, just see its effect, but I do think it has to be the one that provides 2 mana multiple times a turn and tutors. Okay, sure, it doesn't actually add colourless, so you do need other colourless lands in your deck, but yeah, I do think that needs to go. It's just far, far too good for the format. And I don't think Tron needs Ugin either. I think, in fact, the fact that Tron can go turn 3 Karn and have the ability to tutor threats so it never gets empty-handed is silly. I'm already annoyed that Eldrazi in Standard, once they get to the point where they're casting big threats, get to just keep tutoring threats, but thanks to that land, which has no sense of synergy when it's Ugin summoning Eldrazi when they cast Ugin. Yeah, I don't play an aggro deck in Standard. I try to actually, play a more interactive game. But the problem with... yeah, but that's a thing for a different video, and not really a legitimate complaint at all, just a minor annoyance. So yeah, I do think the modern format is bad, and I do think we're going to be seeing a ban soon. If it is having to wait until April, I think you're going to see participation in modern leagues, modern events plummet, because the deck's like 500 tickets on Magic Online, and I can't imagine people who have, just had Twin banned are necessarily going to want to splurge out another 500 ticks on a new deck, especially when they know part of it will get banned. So there won't be people necessarily wanting to invest into the deck unless they already own the pieces, which again isn't investing into it. Or I can't imagine many people wanting to play against it if they don't own that deck. So I do think the modern format is going to get really stale, especially on Magic Online. It may not be so bad in paper, where people just generally play decks they own because it's too much hassle buying new cards, especially with the price inflation and all the Eldrazi stuff going on after the Pro Tour. So you might find your paper metagame is a lot more stable and not degenerate, but you will find your paper format being dominated by the one guy who does go to Eldrazi, which will be insane. He'll basically win every FNM. And the modern GPs, I think you'll find this weekend coming up, will be dominated by Eldrazi again. So, admittedly, we have to wait until the modern GP to really get an idea of the format, and I could be entirely wrong, at which point I'll say, sorry, I was wrong. But I do think we'll see Eldrazi dominate again as well. So, that's been my opinion on the modern format and the modern Pro Tour. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I'll see you next time.